How good is Javi Guerra? What type of midfielder is he from a stylistic point of view? And is he the right signing for Manchester United in comparison to the other options on the market? Well, I'll tell you straight away that I think there's a player who's around the same age as Javi Guerra, who cost around a similar amount, played Premier League football last season, and is not only better in terms of current ability, but also has higher potential as well. I'll tell you who that player is towards the end of the video, but let's start off with the objective statistical analysis by looking at a few plot graphs. So this particular graph shows the volume of defensive duels won per 90 against the percentage of defensive duels won for every midfielder in Europe's top 5 leagues, and you can see that Javi Guerra isn't exactly a high volume tackler, ranking below the median for that particular metric, which is this faint dotted line, but he sits almost bang on the median for the percentage of duels that he wins, and for possessions won against interceptions adjusted for possession. You can also see that he ranks below the median for both of those metrics, and whilst initially you may not pick up on this from the eye test, after seeing the plot graphs and then going over and watching some of the footage, the reason for this does become a lot more noticeable, and I'm going to tell you exactly why in just a minute. But before I get into that, if you want to check out any cheap, good quality football jerseys, go over to jerseyfifa.co. They've got a variety of different current season and retro jerseys, including the new Manchester United releases for the upcoming season. They sent me over this 2006-2007 Manchester United white away shirt with Ronaldo 7 on the back, as well as this Zidane Juventus shirt from the 90s as well. If you use code ATLANTIS at checkout, you'll get a 10% discount, so I'll leave it linked in the description and in the comments section below. So from the eye test, you can see that Javi Guerra is an all-action central midfielder. However, he certainly doesn't have the ball-winning ability that either Ugarte or Casemiro possess, with these two both being high volume tacklers sitting in the top right quadrant for the first graph. But whilst Ugarte does rank slightly lower for the percentage of duels that he wins, as well as frees interceptions and possessions won, Casemiro sits as an outlier at the top right of both graphs, with Anton Stach not far behind either. Javi Guerra, like Mainu, is sitting below the median for nearly all of those defensive metrics, and when watching him play, what you'll notice is that whilst he is very high energy, he does have that Ugarte trait of sometimes committing too early or overly aggressively, leaving himself flat-footed and vulnerable to being bypassed with a turn or a quick change of direction from the player that he's pressing. However, with Ugarte, his immense ball-winning ability does make the trade-off worth it, due to the counter-pressing potential that comes with it. On the other hand, Javi Guerra, like Mainu, isn't as quick across the ground or with his reading of the game as Ugarte, and his tall and lanky frame can actually make it hard for him to turn fluidly. And so whilst I would say that he is quicker than Mainu over longer distances, he doesn't have the same acceleration or even the turning speed of Ugarte, and certainly not of players like Ederson or Lamine Camara. However, Javi Guerra's best qualities do come from his ball carrying. He is 6'2" in height, but he actually does look a bit taller when you watch him play, and whilst he isn't the most deceptive and agile with his turns and swivels out of pressure, he is a lot more comfortable than either Ugarte or Casemiro when it comes to receiving the ball under pressure with his back to goal, particularly in the build-up phase, where he has the awareness to check his shoulder before receiving the ball, alongside the composure to not be rushed into a pass, but can control the ball when necessary and then assess his options. But of course, the best part of Javi Guerra's game is his ball carrying ability and his athleticism when covering ground. As whilst he is a fairly good progressive passer, he definitely excels more when it comes to driving through the centre of the pitch into space, using his long legs to eat up the ground in a way that resembles a Declan Rice or an Amadou Onana. For a player of his size, at times he can be quite deceptively fluid when he's turning out of pressure, before then driving forward, but other times, particularly when he's boxed into tighter spaces, he doesn't seem to have the low centre of gravity as someone like a Mainu to enable him to twist and turn out of the pressure, and can be quite predictable and even clumsy on certain occasions, which he may be able to iron out of his game over time, but naturally he doesn't have the sort of body type that you would usually expect to thrive in these congested areas, being far better when attacking open space. And I think Javi Guerra's ball carrying and dribbling ability is fairly well represented when looking at his FBref report over the past 365 days, where he ranks in the 91st percentile for his carries into the penalty area, as well as around the 70th to 80th percentile range for his two other ball carrying metrics, as well as his successful take-ons. But crucially, you can see that he ranks in his 16th percentile or lower for his missed controls and the percentage of take-ons that he completes, as well as the bottom 2 to 3% for his dispossessions and the times he's been tackled during a take-on, which I think highlights the biggest issue in Javi Guerra's game. See, when watching Javi Guerra throughout a whole match, what is evident is how frequently he turns over the ball. I described him as all action earlier on, and that's because his style of play can be rather erratic at times. He does have the energy to drive the attack forward at pace, but he can also overcarry the ball at times, leading to a breakdown in the attack. And whilst he does have the athleticism to race back into position and even break up the play himself, he still lacks the maturity and the football IQ in his game that you would expect him to improve with experience. But at the moment, considering his ball carrying and dribbling output is where the majority of his quality comes from, in comparison to other central midfielders on the market, I just don't think his output is high enough to overshadow how often he loses possession from these type of situations, which we previously saw with his FB ref report, but can also be seen by this graph, where with progressive carries plotted against ball carrying frequency, you can see that whilst Javi Guerra still ranks above the median for both metrics, he certainly isn't leading the pack, ranking around the same area as Anton Stach, who is far more of a progressive passer than a carrier. And even Bruno Fernandes is recording a greater amount of carries. And so whilst he can be highly effective when carrying the ball into the penalty area with dynamic third man runs from deep, he's not on the same level as someone like Kepran Thuram, for example, when it comes to consistently and frequently progressing the attack forward through the middle and final third of his carries. Now, he certainly doesn't have the same sort of incisive passing quality, using that sort of disguise technique that we see from a Lamine Camara or an Adam Walton, but he is still able to split the opposition's midfield line with a pass through the centre of the pitch. And he is definitely a better progressive passer than Ugarte. And when we look at this graph plotting progressive action rate against progressive actions per 90, you can see that he ranks fairly highly for both metrics, above the median sitting just inside the top right quadrant, with Casemiro sitting in the bottom right quadrant, producing a similar amount of progressive actions per 90, whilst Ugarte, as you probably would expect, is sitting below the median for both of those metrics, but rather surprisingly, Mainu also sits in the bottom left quadrant, only slightly ahead of Ugarte, which I think shows how his development has stagnated over the last season. And so in comparison to United's current central midfield options, apart from Bruno Fernandes of course, who sits on the far right as an outlier, Javi Guerra is just as good as Casemiro and better than both Mainu and Ugarte when it comes to his ability to progress the ball forward, specifically through his passing. However, when you look at where Anton Stach sits, not just for this progressive actions graph, but also for the previous two defensive graphs, he isn't just outperforming Javi Guerra output and percentage-wise for all of those metrics, but he's nearly always sitting towards the top of the pack on the far right of what I call a peloton. Whilst Javi Guerra is undoubtedly a promising young central midfielder, I just don't think he's the best option on the market for that price of between 21 to about £23 million. As both statistically and from the eye test, I do think that Guerra falls short in several key areas when compared against options on the market for that particular price point. Most notably, Anton Stach stands out as a superior option. The German midfielder not only outperforms Guerra as a ball winner, but also offers greater tactical flexibility, being able to slot in as a central centre-back, a versatility that Javi Guerra doesn't possess. The most compelling alternative, however, is Matthias Fernandes. The 21-year-old, fresh off an impressive individual campaign in one of the worst Southampton sides in history, demonstrates all the attributes that United should be seeking. Fernandes' technical profile in particular is exciting, having a fairly physical frame while still maintaining that low centre of gravity, as well as his much greater agility, making him significantly more press resistant than Javi Guerra. His Premier League experience can also be considered a positive factor. It at least makes you a bit more certain of the transition to not just the Premier League, but also to Manchester United in particular. What makes Fernandes truly special, however, is his well-rounded skill set. He provides the progressive carrying and creativity of a Sandro Tonali, with the physicality and industry of Joel Linton, alongside Bruno Guimaraes' football IQ and in-game intelligence. At just £5 to £7 million more than Javi Guerra's asking price, I think he represents far better value for a player who could develop into an elite level midfielder within the next 1 to 3 seasons. Now, this isn't to say that if Javi Guerra was signed, he wouldn't be able to play a key role for Ruben Amorim next season, as I think at his best a Spaniard could potentially fill a role similar to Darren Fletcher's in the 07-08 Manchester United side, an athletic and physically capable box-to-box presence, capable of contributing in both defensive and transitional phases in and out of possession. His athleticism and ball-carrying ability would make him a reasonable stylistic fit for Ruben Amorim's preferred double pivot system. He would be on a relatively low salary, probably around £5 million, which alongside a manageable transfer fee do minimise the financial risk involved. However, even within that price range, I do think there are superior options. Hayden Hackney, whilst not as physically dominant or as powerful in transitional phases as Javi Guerra, offers significantly better progressive passing and chance creating output in comparison. The Middlesbrough midfielder excels at threading balls through the centre of the pitch and finding players between the lines, whilst also still being a fairly high output ball carrier, as well as being a bit better in congested areas higher up the pitch. And so overall, I just think that Hayden Hackney's skill set would be of greater value to this United squad than Javi Guerra's. And so I have to conclude that Javi Guerra would be a C-tier signing, not disastrous, but hardly inspiring. He would improve United's midfield athleticism and provide decent ball progression. I don't think he's got the mid to long term potential of players like Hayden Hackney or Matheus Fernandes, who I will be covering in a video that should be out either today or tomorrow, so make sure you subscribe to the channel if you do want to see an in-depth analysis of Southampton's Matheus Fernandes. But let me know what you think of Javi Guerra in the comment section below, and if you want to check out any cheap, good quality football jerseys, go over to jerseyfifa.co. You can use code Atlantis at checkout for a 10% discount. I'll leave it linked in the description below. And if you do want to see any of the plot graphs, you can sign up to my Patreon and get a 7-day free trial.